This Dicebreaker video is sponsored by Wild Bills. Ditch the manufactured flavors. Your taste buds deserve better. Treat yourself to Wild Bill's premium handcrafted soda pop. Mouth-watering beverages that allow you to escape to the most interesting places imaginable. Cheers to refusing the drink from the mainstream. Cheers to kick-ass canned. Cheers to being veteran-owned and operated. At Wild Bills, flavor isn't everything. It's the only thing. Use discount code CHEERS15 for 15% off your first order.
Tabletop games sure have come a long way since the 1930s, when the Parker Brothers first unleashed the game of Monopoly onto the world. We've seen massive innovations in play and design across the industry, whole new genres rising their heads from the primordial soup, and designs that literally would not be possible at the time Monopoly was first published. Board games and everything related to them are better now than they have ever been, and yet, to this day, Monopoly is still one of the largest board games in the world, available in 37 different languages in toy and bookshops the world over. There's even a McDonald's Monopoly promotion if you want an example of just how omnipresent it is. If you say you're into board games, and it's not unlikely someone will assume that you spend your nights playing Monopoly with your mates, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Despite its mainstream appeal, ask most big board game fans if they want to play a game of Monopoly, honestly me included, and they'll likely roll their eyes or grimace at the mere suggestion. So why is that? What's so bad about Monopoly? Why does it harbour so much disdain? Well, it's a complicated thing to explain, and to start, we're going to have to go all the way back to 1903 to when Monopoly was known under an entirely different name. Elizabeth Magie was an American game designer, writer, and inventor born in Illinois in 1866. Born to newspaper publisher and abolitionist James K. Magie, who would spend the 1850s accompanying Abraham Lincoln during the Lincoln-Douglas debates around Illinois, Elizabeth was no stranger to quite progressive politics from an early age. She was somewhat of a jack of all trades, dipping her toes into all sorts of pastimes and professions, including poetry, comedy, theatre, and even engineering. In fact, at the age of just 26, Magie received a patent for an invention of her own design that eased the process of typewriting, something she was intimately familiar with due to her time as a stenographer in the early 1880s. This is a time where women were credited with less than 1% of all patents filed. She was a woman that believed in equality, a staunch feminist and political activist, as well as a believer in the principles of Georgism. For those who are not in the know, and that includes me, I didn't realise what this was until I started researching for this video, Georgism is an economic ideology popular among some political theorists of the time, developed from the writings of Henry George. Georgists believe that instead of the standard method of taxation, where a percentage is taken from income or capital or whatever source that comes straight from the work of those producing the value in the economy, there should instead be a universal land tax that increases or decreases based on the usefulness, size, and location of owned land in the state. Bear in mind that this is a time where land ownership is basically the entirety of the economy in the country. Like, the US was in a place where if you owned land, you were sorted, and if you didn't, you were at the whims of whoever owned the land you were on. Also, in general, Americans, not massive fans of being taxed. So Georgism wanted to tax the value of the land itself across the country to fund the American government, after which any leftover funds could then equally be shared and fairly distributed among the citizens of the state. This was a pretty enticing system for a lot of progressive political leaders because it was seen to motivate land cultivation, it put money in the hands of those who had low socioeconomic standing, and it got rid of the idea that landowners and landlords held all the power of the land that citizens used, despite not really contributing to anything that was made on that land. Magie was a big believer in Georgism, and she wasn't the type of person to keep her beliefs to herself. When she was working as a stenographer, she was making a measly wage that she had no way of supporting herself on without marrying a man and becoming a sort of kept woman. In protest of this, she posted a newspaper advertisement trying to auction herself off as a young woman American slave, looking for a husband who could own her. She wanted to show people the position that women were in the world at the time. stating quite openly that the only people who were truly free in the United States were white men. So, not being one to keep quiet about her political beliefs, Magie was looking for an effective way to espouse the virtues of Georgism. It could have been any of her multitude of talents that she leaded on to bring home the message, but it was actually game design where she would take her focus instead. In 1903, Magie applied for a patent once again for what was to be then known as the Landlord's game, that patent then being granted in 1904. The Landlord's game takes place on a strikingly familiar board setup in which the players move around a track, taking ownership of properties and charging rent on those that land on them. The Landlord's game was originally designed to demonstrate how much damage a system that allows the monopoly of land ownership can cause, and tries to highlight how some of that damage can be avoided with the use of land value tax as Georgism dictates. The game existed in two separate versions. The first is essentially modern day Monopoly. The players move freely around the board, swallowing up every space worth of property they can, and then slowly grind the other players down to the point where they're forced to sell their own lands, with the winner being determined by, well, who ends up with everything at the end. This is the version that players would first be introduced to, and was supposed to represent the current system that Americans were living under. The goal was to try and show just how horrible a system like this can be for everyone but the person who ends up with the monopoly. This was especially effective on children who are acutely aware of when they're being treated unfairly, which would hopefully make them more aware of that unfair treatment as they grew older and entered the workforce. Fun fact, injustice is one of the earliest concepts a child's brain will form in their development. Once the players had been subjected to the drudgery of the first version of the game, Magie would then introduce the second version of the game that instead followed Georgist principles. The anti-monopolist Georgist version of the game not only showed that land tax would stop one person running away with everything and leaving all the other destitute at the end, it also had a more cooperative end goal, with the win state being when the player with the lowest monetary amount had doubled their original stake. If it's not clear already, the Landlord's game is the Monopoly that we all know today, but I wouldn't be surprised if you had never heard of Elizabeth Magie before today. She's not credited as the original designer, and until the 1970s her design was entirely lost to the public eye. But how did this happen? Enter a man named Charles Darrow. After a pleasant meal with his friend and Philadelphia businessman Charles Todd in 1932, the two Charleses sat down with their wives to play a copy of Magie's game that Todd had recently learned. The Landlord's game was not a massive commercial success. Most of the copies that existed were just unlabeled boxes of components passed from friend to friend. In fact, it's unlikely that the players even knew the official name of the game, as it was more commonly just referred to as the Monopoly game. There was no official rulebook, no place you could feasibly purchase a copy of the game from. It was just something that you were taught. It perplexed Charles Todd then when Darrow asked him to write down a copy of the full rules for the game that they had played after many an evening spent in revelry with the thing. It was even stranger then when Charles Darrow claimed to have emerged from his basement, struck by inspiration, with a brand new board game under the name of Monopoly, that he of course invented all on his own with no help. Original content, do not steal. It was this rather bastardized version of Maggie's original rule set that was then sold to the Parker brothers and became the blockbuster hit that we know it as today. Darrow and the Parker brothers made a shed load of money, and Magie made around $500 and no royalties from the Parker brothers buying up the Landlord's game patent and two of her other titles. So little that she couldn't even recuperate the costs of the original game's patents and fees. To make it even more egregious, there's supposedly a typo that was made on the original board of the Landlord's game that Darrow hadn't even fixed when he brought out his own version. So, not a great foundation for this classic, not morally anyway, but what does this have to do with the game itself? And if this story isn't very well known, then what does it have to do with the general hatred towards Monopoly as a game? Well, despite it maybe seeming quite revolutionary at the time, Maggie's original patent for the Landlord's game was the first to feature a continuous looping path, so I think anything would have seemed revolutionary, honestly. But despite all that though, the game itself isn't designed to be fun. I know that might sound strange for a game, but you have to remember that the Landlord's game isn't just a fun pastime, it's also designed to prove a point. Whilst one player around the table might be flying high as they squeeze every cent out of their competitors, for the rest of the people playing, they'll be subjugated to this long slog of slowly going bankrupt with not much that they can do about it. But that's the point. Magie wanted players to feel like they'd been cheated, like they were unfairly cast asunder, so that when she brought out the second version of the game that showed the virtues of her cause, they'd implant themselves even further. The natural human drive for competition might have left the more cooperative second version of the game out of the limelight when Darrow and the Parker brothers brought the idea to the masses, but without it, Monopoly is just a game that was designed to make you frustrated. Without the whole, let's take a look at what you could have won reveal at the end, you just have 75% of the players cursing their luck after the game. And let's be honest, it is a game of luck. There's a pretty common thing in board game circles where a game will be rated on a scale of how luck-based it is. And there's a good reason for this that's not just players being sore losers, I promise. The scale offers an insight to how much agency the player has when they sit down to a game. Games of absolute pure luck, like a roulette wheel for example, might have the illusion of choice that its players bring with a big table of different bet options that you can take, but even the most savvy gamblers are still at the whims of the spin. If you're betting on red and it comes up black every time, then you've lost money. You didn't necessarily do anything wrong, luck just didn't go your way. For an even better example, if you were just betting on a literal coin toss, would you feel like you were in control of the outcome? On the opposite end of the spectrum, you might have a game like chess or checkers. There's no random chance, both players start with the exact same setup of pieces, and there's not a dice roll in sight. Every move that you make is up to you, and if you fail, it's because of your own and your opponent's actions throughout the course of the game, not because of a throw of the dice or the spin of a wheel. Now, there are some pretty boring purists out there who believe that even the slightest hint of random chance in a game means that it's a lesser experience, which I personally think is bollocks. The problem with no chance is that the games can get quite dull and predictable. You can't make a move in chess without it already having its own name and thesis paper attached to it. The trick then for a lot of games is finding the balance between these two ideals that match the experience they're trying to create. Bits of luck or randomization will, change up the playing field for the players, keeping things fresh and exciting. But if too much luck is involved, then players can get frustrated as they seemingly lose games where they've made all of the right moves. That's because player choice is a really important thing in games, feeling like the state of the board is directly affected by your actions. Without it, you might as well just be watching the spin of a roulette wheel. When it comes to Monopoly, the game is so far slanted toward the random chance end of the scale, the player agency is almost non-existent. I promise I'm not trying to punch down on a game that's been around since the early 1900s, but it is just kind of snakes and ladders with extra steps. The players have a maximum of 2 situations in which they can make a meaningful choice. When they're asked to pay for something, or when they can trade with other players. Do you want to buy the property? The answer is almost always yes, because you only win the game by buying properties. The only real reason that you wouldn't buy one, in fact, is to save for another that you might not even land on. And if you don't buy it, then it lets everyone else around the board auction it off for a potentially even cheaper price. So if you've got the money, then why wouldn't you? And remember that this is only a choice for about half of the game. Once all the properties are gone, you can only acquire them through deals made with other players, which usually amount to I'll finish your set if you finish mine, or through someone going bankrupt. Now, a lot of people will then point out the houses and hotels that you have the option to put them where you like, so there's strategy in where you place them, but again, you can choose what number you bet on a roulette table. It doesn't mean that you're changing the outcome. Again, I'm not trying to rag on the game and tell you why you should hate Monopoly. I'm just trying to explain why it can be such a frustrating thing to play and why people already do hate it. It was never meant to be fun for anyone but the winner. And even then, it's slow, unforgiving, and your options are so limited that they might as well be non-existent. So okay, it's not a great game. It's old and clunky and maybe better suited to kids than it is to adults, but so are a lot of games. Is Monopoly really that more deserving of all this hatred than any of the other classic board games that have existed for over a century? Well, actually, maybe yes, because despite it being the very thing that Elizabeth Magie was trying to warn against with her design, Monopoly's publisher and right owner Hasbro has a bit of a monopoly on the tabletop market themselves. It might be difficult to reconcile when you look at Hasbro as a company, the people who make Connect 4 and Trivial Pursuit and Cluedo and yes, Monopoly, that they're actually absolutely massive fish in a small pond. But at the time of writing this script, Fortune 500 stated the market value of Hasbro to be around $13 billion. If you watched our video on the RPG market in Japan, you might remember me saying that Dungeons & Dragons has an absolute stranglehold on the RPG market in most parts of the world. Magic the Gathering isn't doing half bad in the CCG market either. Well, guess who owns Wizard of the Coast, the makers of both of those properties? Yeah, Hasbro. Honestly, they're massive. It's difficult to avoid their presence in the toys and game space. If you see a toy from Marvel, Disney, Transformers, Star Wars, Nerf, or My Little Pony, you'll see a Hasbro logo on the corner of the box. When a company that has that much reach and that many contacts, their presence is difficult to avoid. Almost every month we seem to be hit with a press release for a new edition of Monopoly that's basically just the same game but with a different brand slapped on top. Marvel, Star Wars, Rick and Morty, Warhammer 40k, yes, that's real. It's never ending and frankly a little exhausting. Not to mention that we're also treated to some pretty stupid boomer humour in the cringe-inducing Millennials Monopoly and Monopoly Socialism Edition, which has about all the nuance that you can expect. The Socialist Edition of Monopoly already exists, Hasbro. It's called The Landlord's Game by Elizabeth Magie. According to the Washington Post, upon the release of their great female figures version of Monopoly named Ms. Monopoly, famed feminist, political activist, and the original patent holder and inventor for the Landlord's Game was not credited. Look, if you like Monopoly, then more power to you. I'm glad you're having a good time. And if everyone tries to shame you for not liking it, then it's them that sucks, not you, I promise. But if you're at a gathering of family and friends deciding on a game to play and someone suggests Monopoly, you might notice someone around the table roll their eyes or grimace at the suggestion. And honestly, they've probably got their reasons. Whether it's the mistreatment of the original designer, the pretty staunch pro-capitalist themes that it carries, or even just the design of the game itself, Monopoly can be a pretty difficult game to stomach losing an evening to, so maybe give something else a try. In fact, we've got a heck of a lot of recommendations for fantastic games right here on Dicebreaker, so please do hit subscribe and click the bell icon to see whenever we put a new video live, or maybe check out dicebreaker.com for written articles and news all about the tabletop world. If you're already a fan of the channel, then you can support us even further by hitting the like button, sharing our videos, or even joining up to become a member of Dicebreaker Plus, our YouTube subscription service that gets you extra videos, emotes to use in chats and comments, and a special dice badge by your name. Lastly, you can find a link in this video's description for our merch store, where we've got some new items just added, so why not check them out? But whatever you decide to do next, let me just say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this pretty chunky video, and until I see you next, have a lovely day.